Hi, this is Carl, also known as Airpath in the Custom Magic community, and today I want to do a deck tech and hopefully a game if anybody decides to join. But regardless, I wanted to go over this deck. So yesterday I made this video of top 7 cross-set synergies and custard. One of them that I went over was the combination between Enforcer of the Wild and Witch's Invocation. I go over a few different things you can do with the combo in the video I made yesterday. You can find that elsewhere on my channel. But I just got to brewing. I started making the deck. I got some feedback on it in the deck building channel, and someone pointed out a few really cool things. Well, first of all, so just to go over the basic combo again, Enforcer of the Wild. Basically, each turn that player gets everybody's lands. The problem is the first person to get to use that is your opponent, which is why we use Witch's Invocation to flash it in at the end of their turn so that you get to be the first one to have all the lands. And then at that point, you just try and do really broken stuff. Um, so one thing I neglected to mention in the video yesterday, I talked about using Rico to sacrifice all of the lands and make a bunch of warriors so they don't even get any lands back. Um, that would have put the deck into 4 colors. It was a little janky. I didn't go there. We're still plenty janky, don't worry. But one thing I neglected to mention in that video was taking extra turns. Extra turns are a great thing to do, both to use your mana and get advantage, while also not giving your opponent the chance to ever use Enforcer of the Wild's drawback, for them to get all the lands and use their mana instead of you. Um, So we've got a couple Seas Tomorrows and a couple Seas Betrayal. Why is that split? Well, there's some turns where you need to dig for your extra turn spell, and you don't quite have the mana to dig for it and pay 9 mana for Seas Betrayal. And so instead, we have kind of a split of Seas Tomorrow and Seas Betrayal. Being able to Seas Betrayal on a turn where you have Enforcer of the Wild live is really, really good, because then you get one turn to do a bunch of stuff with your mana to really dig, draw cards, play another Enforcer of the Wild, and then on the following turn, then you can use everything you set up with to try and win. How does this deck end up winning? Usually it's just with attacking during your extra turns. Well, how do you ensure that the board is clear enough you can actually attack with this? Well, two things. One is you should always attack with Enforcer of the Wild, because if they decide they need to trade with Enforcer, that means they're not getting your lands on their turn. So you've effectively spent 5 mana for this 5/5. You attack with it, you trade with something, but you still get all of that mana on your turn, and they don't get to use all the lands on theirs. So it's still worthwhile. Um, the second thing is this card Level the Landscape. Each player chooses any number of creatures they control with total power less than or equal to the number of lands they control. So basically, they can't have more creature power than they do have lands. When you take all the lands, this is a one-sided, it's a Plague Wind for 3 mana. And it also has plane cycling, so even if you're not on these combo turns where you've played Enforcer of the Wild and you have all the lands and you can wipe their board, this is sometimes just useful against a mono red deck that's really committed to the board and they've got like a Screecher and a Hatchling and some other stuff. You can at least get a Screecher out of that, um, and maybe something else as well. This is really good against Boggles, and just the plane cycling is good too for hitting lands. If you just need to cycle this to hit your land drops to be able to interact with your opponent, you can do that. So having 3 of these is still plenty live. Seas Betrayal is not really live at any point except on your combo turns, which is a weakness of the deck, right? Seas Tomorrow, if you're close to being able to, if for some reason you get to 10 mana, I guess you could Seize Tomorrow and Enforcer of the Wild in the same turn if for whatever reason you can't find your Witch's Invocation. But most importantly, these just help you get to extra turns with Enforcer of the Wild without your opponent having their turn with the Enforcer's trigger. Let's talk about the other things in the deck. So we only have 2 of the Witch's Invocation, even though it's really critical to the combo. You should never try and play Enforcer and just hope that they don't have anything to do with all of the lands on their turn. I doubt that would ever go well. Maybe if they are Hellbent, it's a risk you can take if you really need to. Um, but I try and avoid it. You should be able to find witches fairly easily when you need to, and that's because of this card, Zulev Rites. It's a 1-mana tutor from Erelu, lets you find any enchantment. So why isn't this just 2 more copies of Witch's Invocation? Past the first copy, Witch's Invocation doesn't do anything, right? It makes me wonder if this should be 4 Zulev Rites. I should only have 1 Witch's Invocation. The issue is if it gets O-ringed, then you need the second copy. Well, you can write for a couple other cards. Cradle of Civilization is an excellent land trip, if that's a term. It fixes your mana, which is important when you're 3 colors and you have, you have 3 blue pips on that one, and then Enforcer of the Wild is 3 green pips over there. But you also have some interactive spells like Wander the Unknown and some other uses for white. So it's a really good thing to have. It's also, it's just good for hitting land drops and fixing your mana. So very, very good in that sense. It's like a 1-mana cultivate um, that doesn't ramp you. And then the other one is Ancient Imprisonment, which is an O-ring only for creatures, but it also ramps you a bit. So if you're stuck at 4 mana and you're not drawing your 5th land, this can help you in those situations sometimes as well, because it O-rings something and it gives you some mana ramp, depending on the color of the thing that you've O-ringed. Okay, I looked at a couple other cards. We talked about Level the Landscape, Plague Winding them on Enforcer turns. Let's talk a little bit more about Enforcer turns, because that's the goal of the deck and how you're going to win. So, ideally, turn 4, you've hit a Witch's Invocation, which should not be too hard in this deck. Turn 5, if you can manage it, you don't cast anything. If you have to, you can interact and hold this off for another turn. But you Enforcer of the Wild at the end of the turn. Beginning of your turn, you untap your lands, right? You have 5 lands, likely. And this triggers. In response to the trigger, you want to tap all your lands and add mana to the mana pool. Because then this will happen, you get all the lands, and they all get untapped. So you basically don't just double your mana, roughly, with Enforcer of the Wild, you actually triple it. You can double your own mana and get their lands. So you're usually looking at about at least 15 mana on your turns when you use Enforcer of the Wild, and it gets even more out of control if you have multiple Enforcers of the Wild, because you tap your lands in response to the first trigger, and then they untap with the first trigger, and you get all the lands, and then in response to the second trigger, you tap all the lands, and they all untap, and then you're looking at like 30 mana. So, incredibly strong. However, you have to be able to do it during your upkeep. Well, what can you cast during your upkeep? Only instants, right? But we do have one big instant which you can cast during your upkeep, which is Epic of Echobram. You can use it to wipe their board for a turn. You can use it as interaction to just survive. If you find yourself in a situation you're still putting the combo together and you need to be able to interact with your opponent more than you already are, you can counter and draw cards. So counter while still digging for your combo. On Enforcer turns, when you have all of this mana, but you haven't necessarily found the best ways to abuse the mana, draw lots of cards. You can draw 5 to 10 cards during your upkeep and still have 5 mana left over afterwards, depending on what you draw, to play a Seize Tomorrow and get another turn after you've drawn all those cards. So ideally, you're finding an extra turn cards. At the minimum, what you really want to find is a Level the Landscape. Because Level the Landscape, Plague Winding them, and then being able to attack in with 5, maybe 10 damage. And if you manage, so if you hit Level the Landscape and a Seize Tomorrow, that's amazing, because you get to wipe their board, attack in this turn and the next turn for sure. So that's really strong. Being able to draw lots of cards and then get the additional turn to then spend mana on those cards is very strong. Seats Betrayal is a great one to find also. It does a similar thing as finding multiple extra turn cards in a row because it's just all on one card. You can spend that on one turn, spend another turn just drawing your deck with Epic of Ekabram, or leveling the landscape and wiping their board and attacking in, and then being able to attack in again. So you just win by attacking through their empty board after you've cast Level the Landscape, or wiping their board with a big Epic of Ekabram where you return all their stuff to their hand. So how do we last that long? How do we survive? Like, we have a lot of cards dedicated to the combo here, right? So 10 of our sorceries are either devoted to finding the combo or doing things once we have it. Level the Landscape can do other things. Zul of Rights can find other things just to help us survive. Epic of Ekabram can interact, but it's also part of the combo. Wander the Unknown, having that as a 4 of, gives us a really good ability to last to turn 5. You really need this instant speed interaction against the faster aggro decks in the format. It's really good against Crest. It's really good against combo decks that cheat things in, like Emerge. So being able to run 4 of these is well worth going into white. Additionally, Ancient Imprisonment. It's not a 3-mana O-Ring. Maybe Long Journeys would be better here. But, well, it would be better, except that this can be tutored not just by Zul of Rights, it can also be tutored by Ruler of Cities. I've played some testing games against Saul. He was testing Abzan Ruler, which has Ruler of the Cities and this enchant land package that it can tutor, and then it gains 2 life every time he plays an enchant land. I found that package to be very good against aggro, at least for surviving. And aggro still has some game against it, but I think particularly in a combo deck like this, where you just need to survive until the critical turn and then you can essentially win, to be very useful here. Also, since we need some toolbox enchantments to make Zul of Rights worth running instead of just running 4 Witches Invocation, having these that are also tutorable from Ruler of Cities is very good. So we've got this great toolbox of enchantments from both Zul of Rights and Ruler of Cities, and the life gain that comes from that. We've, Enforcer is the point of the deck. Tempered Inculum, I think, should be a 4 of in many decks. It's just incredibly flexible in any kind of matchup, and in any kind of board state. Like, if you're behind, you gain life. If you can finish them off, you can make them lose life. If you're against control and you want to put pressure on, you can make them lose life. If you're against aggro, you really need to stabilize, you gain life. And it's a great body for blocking as well. The 3 toughness is incredible against most aggro bodies. Just an excellent card to have. Very good for giving you another turn. Almost always worth playing on turn 3. And yeah, so that's the deck. Land base, I'm not as confident in. I think it probably, I haven't tuned it using like Frank Karsten's mana math. I've just kind of gone with what feels right in my head conceptually. There's a little bit more blue and green. There's a significant more amount of blue and green than there is white mana. But as I've goldfished this deck, it's worked out okay. Let's see if anybody... No. Looking at the sideboard, Pithing Needle is always a good sideboard card. That's in real Magic as well. It's if they have some Planeswalkers that are causing us problems, like maybe they have an Eli that can kill our Enforcer as soon as it comes down. Well, I guess not if we're playing it with Flash, but Pithing Needle is good against Planeswalker decks, or you can hit a Sarasa if you're playing against a Crest deck with that. Slow down their ramp and their card selection. Containment Priest, good against Crest when they cheat stuff in, or Emerge when they cheat stuff in. It just has a lot of utility against specific decks, so that's good. Gila Emergence, I think if I were to guess which deck does best against an Enforcer deck, it's probably Control. we don't really have a lot of ways of interacting with control. We have the 3 Epic of Ekabram, and that's it for protecting our spells. And that's not really going to protect our spells. Like, we need absurd amounts of mana to be able to actually protect our spells with Epic of Ekabram. And at that point, they have so much mana that the counterspell mode is not going to be very good. So to kind of combat that, we have Gila Emergence. We start doing more of a proactive game plan against control. This can't be countered. We can start attacking them with our land. They can still try and remove it with their own instant speed removal, but we know that at least the spell can't be countered. And we keep in our other creatures just to put on pressure. So Tempered Ankelin becomes really good. Ruler of Cities becomes good just for being able to find Gila Emergence. We add in another Epic against control just for those big end of turn, draw lots of cards, or counter their thing and draw a card. Those are really good things to be able to do against control. And then the 4 negates. That's going to do a better job of protecting our creatures, protecting our combo pieces. And so those are the 7 cards we bring in against control as Gila Emergence, Epic, and Negate. Things we take out, we probably take out some Wanders, Ancient Imprisonments. We keep at least one in for toolbox purposes. And Level the Landscape doesn't become as important. We take at least one of those away. I don't know what the numbers add up to, but we don't hurt the port combo itself very much by siding in even these 7 cards, because we're just taking out a lot of our creature interaction. Then we have 2 Final Verdict and a Level of the Landscape. These are for aggro aristocrats, any deck where they're just filling the board. Also boggles when they're filling the board, with height instead of width. We already have Level the Landscape, but it does not hurt to be even better against them. Yeah, having the 4th Level the Landscape is worth it against the aggro decks as well, just because, in the weird situations where we don't want to chip away at their board, we can still plain cycle it. Also, being able to hit Level the Landscape on your first Enforcer turn is really important. And then against aggro, once you've wiped their board, you're not as worried about them having all the lands on their next turn, because they'll have fewer ways to use the mana. So that is the deck. This is Bant Enforcer. I was hoping somebody would be able to play, but it doesn't look like they can right now. If I find a game later, I'll record that video and add that to the channel as well. But yeah, thanks for watching. That was Bant Enforcer.